Hi. So this wasn't originally going to be part of the plan. Well, this wasn't part of the plan. I was just gonna review books and talk about books because I like books. But I've been thinking about these things lately, and because I'm in the middle of moving country, um, it's kind of difficult to talk about them with people all the time. And I thought maybe what I could do is just talk about the stuff to my phone because that's what I've got. And maybe some of you out there will have things to contribute to this conversation that I'm having with myself. So basically, it's a new year, it's the start of the year, and I've been thinking with all the changes that are going on in my life, how I would like to move forward with certain areas of my life. And in this respect, obviously, I'm talking about spiritual pursuits. And so, how is that going to look in a new country, in a new city, without all of the connections that I have, without my understanding of the surroundings that I'm in, without all of the tools that I have become so used to having, which I've decided not to carry with me because knives and borders, probably not the best idea. But, sorry, I thought my flatmate was home. But what I've been thinking in this process, I've just been journaling about this idea of commitment and tradition, right? So the idea of having a set way of doing things or a kind of fallback and a structure and something to look to help with, navigating the absolute overabundance of information that we have in today's world. Things are so accessible. How do we pick what to apply? How do we ensure that we're actually moving forward and not just running around in circles consuming information? And in moving to a new country, I'm essentially severing ties with the tradition that I've been operating within, at least for now. But thankfully, I've got a lot of solitary experience in various areas. And so what I've been thinking about is how to apply those things. What does that look like when I remove everything else, and obviously wanting to simplify things so that I was actively engaging a practice and having spiritual depth and connection without overloading myself or feeling hampered by my situation and my resources. And so obviously this idea of committing to a single focused practice. So devotional things or operating within a certain system has come up. But what I find, and I'm sure that it's not just me, but I have this thing, in my head, I always associate it with what Stephen Pressfield calls resistance, that it's kind of like the shadow cast by the light of inspiration. And so you see a thing and you're like, yeah, this is awesome. And then shortly after that, you get all of the reasons why it's not so awesome, or the distractions and whatever. And I think distraction is totally the thing, and it's what I've been sort of wrestling with is what I want to commit myself to and what the causes are or the fears or what is the motivation behind being distracted and looking at other things, and how do we learn how to address that and not just chase our tails for the rest of our lives? How do we progress through that and deepen our practice and our connection to our practices? So I kind of made my decision about what I was going to be focusing my practice on, what I was going to be carrying forward as my central structure. And almost immediately what tends to happen is something else catches my attention. So, like Lucifer just walks real slowly past my front door and I'm like, yeah, that looks like fun. I kind of want to go do that. Or, whatever. Just like I go to a party where people are experimenting with initiation into Hermetics and I'm like, yeah, I'm totally down for being a Bardinist for the next month. And so how do we break that cycle? And not just break the cycle, but minimize the impulse for it. And I think it's great that we can have these eclectic experiences and bounce around between things, but at the end of the day, it's not really getting us anywhere to just, it's a lack of depth in a lot of ways. And so, sorry, I just kicked a chair. What I find interesting, I suppose, is this kind of psychology and looking at ideas of faith and commitment. And, one of the things that has kind of come up in my head is, well, like the Abrahamic faiths probably epitomize the ability to willfully cling to their ideas, right? Like they don't look at someone having experiences of tantric yoga or whatever and think, yeah, or they don't look at images of, I don't know, Norse gods and think, damn, I might get in on some of that. And I think this is maybe a bit of a peril of not belonging to an established structure or an ingrained cultural history in that sense. Obviously there's cultural history in things like Norse religion, but you know what I mean. And one thing I find really interesting is, so the Christians, for example, I don't really know so much about the Jewish and Islamic faith, but the Christians have a lot of strategies, I suppose, in place. So, they devote time to reading the mythology of their gods or their god, and they interact with that mythology, they discuss it, and they look at the lessons that they have in them and they apply them to their lives, and they actively resonate with the stories of they actively transpose the stories of their gods, their own mythology, whatever, onto their lives and live through that. And I think, maybe that's a really cool thing, except most of the gods that I work with or the spirits that I work with don't have established mythologies that you can just read through. They do, but unless you're operating within particular... Anyway, it's complicated. So it's like, what do you do if you lack written material to engage with? And it's like, well, there's the practice, but like sometimes practicing the same thing over and over again just gets really boring. And, so what things... what is that? What do you do about that? And then I was thinking, well, what are the things that you're being drawn to, right? So if, for example, I've been practicing chaos magic for a year and all of a sudden really getting into or really liking the look of, gosh, I don't know, Santeria and, Tibetan Buddhism, right? And so it's like, what are the things in those systems that I'm seeing that are inspiring a sense of interest? What is it that I'm being drawn to? Is it certain practices that they have? Is it literally just the aesthetics of the spirits? Is it a sense that you get that the work they're doing is somehow more effective or powerful? And it's like, well, what is it addressing in you? Is it that you feel it has more of an ability to what am I trying to say? Is it that you feel it has more of an ability to comfort you in tough times, or it focuses on an aspect of life that you feel could be beneficial for you that is somehow lacking in what you're already doing? Is there a sense of community that comes with a particular system that you feel lacks in your tradition or system practice? And by identifying these elements, perhaps you can find ways of identifying them within your own practice. How can you engage with your practice so that it does meet the needs of socializing, right? Or comforting you in tough times, or empowering you to be active and moving forward. What are the things that are missing, and are they actually inherently missing from the system you're currently working, or is it just that you haven't engaged those things yet? You haven't previously looked for them, and maybe they're not the primary focus of your system. I think it's about to rain. Beautiful. It smells like rain. Yeah, and I guess I've just kind of been wrestling with these things. And as someone who comes from a household that had essentially an absence of religious thinking, I don't think that the idea of committing myself in that way comes naturally. I never learnt the mechanisms of things like faith. And I suppose how that translates obviously going to be very different from system to system. So in traditional Wicca, for example, you're not going to be necessarily required to think a certain way or even believe a certain way. But if you're doing the rituals, right, if you're following the tradition and you're having the experience, which I find is the truth, right? Like, you do the rituals and the experience kind of creates the reality of the things that you're supposed to be believing in, even if you don't believe in them prior. And then I guess you just formulate an opinion based on your experience. But also the realization that nothing's fixed, like this idea that we have to come into a practice with a complete cosmology that operates across all bases is just kind of silly. Like, it's going to change and evolve based on your needs and your circumstances and your experiences. And it's just... Anyway, these are the things that I'm thinking about at the moment. I'm not even sure. Anyway, what I found really interesting also is this morning I was transcribing some of the rituals for the system that I'm going to be hopefully committing myself to for the next year, while I get set up in the new country. And I found myself really loving it again, which was really interesting because I suppose there are aspects of that system that aren't essentially part of... Well, they're not the essential practice, right? They're not the daily thing. And so if all you're doing is the daily commitments, it's really easy to lose sight of the breadth of the tradition, what else is there. And I think sometimes maybe it's as simple as that, like finding something new that's a little bit exciting, go and do some grave walking, compose a ritual bath, cast a freaking spell, right? Like, just do something that makes you feel excited and be creative. Maybe there's a particular kind of ritual that you like the look of, but like, how could you plug that into your system? Or how could you achieve that goal with your own methodology? Anyway, I think I'm just kind of ranting at you now. I don't know if I actually really said anything. I just kind of wanted to talk about this idea of commitment to a system or a tradition, and kind of the inherent struggles that come along with it, because I think a lot of people talk about the human aspect of traditions, and like, oh well, it's really hard having to believe what other people believe, or get along with these people, and hierarchy is terrible. But I don't think I haven't seen a lot of people talking about the internal concept of commitment, and the resistance that can come up in response to that, because I mean, it's one thing to think about all of the options and then pick one, but it's completely different to then stick to it, and to do so in a non-ignorant, aggressive way as well. Anyway, what are your thoughts? How do you deal with it? Well, first of all, are you committed to a strict practice, right? Do you follow a particular tradition? Are you completely open-ended and eclectic about everything? Like, is there a fundamental structure that you follow? Are you part of a community? Do you find yourself facing issues of intellectual, I don't know what to call it, monogamy, right? Like, I mean, we're all a little bit slutty, I guess, in some ways, but I don't know. I guess it's just interesting to me that people commit themselves to a thing, and like, how do you deal with it, right? Do you ever experience that sense of wanting to cross the fence, and how do you approach that? How do you deal with that? How does that operate within the confines of your structure? Anyway, this is nearly 20 minutes long. I'm so sorry. Oh God.